Hello, this is Mark Lieberman, host of the show The World According to Mark, and we are interviewing Victoria Browning Wyeth on the show today. And I want to thank Victoria for agreeing to be on the show.
Thank you for having me, Mark.
So you have a famous name, Wyeth, and you are doing a lecture series or a lecture at the Asheville Museum of Art in Asheville, North Carolina, which we're going to talk about. But before we do, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I just turned 43 on Monday, and I grew up in New York City. And ever since I was a baby, my parents and I would go to Maine. We have a family place in Cushing, Maine. And so Maine was always a huge part of my life. And when I was about 15 or 16 years old, I really needed a summer job. So I started giving lectures at a museum there called the Farnsworth Art Museum in Rockland, Maine. And as a 16-year-old, I had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. So I would sit down with my grandfather and he would, just kind of briefly explain the pictures to me. And this went on for, until I was in college. And then after graduate school, I did the lectures all through college and graduate school in the summer. And after graduate school, I decided I really wanted to take care of my grandparents and moved to Chadds Ford, Pennsylvania. I have no siblings or first cousins. So, my grandfather was getting older. My grandmother had dementia. And so I started doing the lectures at the Brandywine River Museum. And it was different because I was older, the paintings were different. And the crowds were different. It wasn't kind of just summer people coming in. It was people from all over the world. So I started writing down the questions that people had. And I would go home every day to my grandparents and sit there with my grandfather. And he would explain everything to me and answer their questions. And then I came up with this idea of doing PowerPoints. He said, "What's that?" And I said, "Well, it requires you giving me digital images of your work." And he said, "Well, here's the deal. You come up with a lecture topic and then you can interview me." So I came up with like 15 or 20 lecture topics and really tried to just learn as much about his work as possible. And then when he died, I started interviewing his models. So I have what he told me, what he told my grandfather, and what he told his models. My only rule is I refuse to watch videos or documentaries on him and read books on him. I feel like it kind of taints my perception of his work. So when I speak, it's really his voice, not so much mine infused with his.
Okay. So preserving your understanding based upon the many times in which you talked to him, interviewed him, and so on and so forth. So let's, when did Andrew Wyeth die approximately?
January 16th, 2009.
Okay. So a while ago, but not ancient history by any means. Why don't you tell us? I mean, most people probably have heard the name. I've heard the name. I'm not a student of art, but tell us a little bit about Andrew Wyeth, the painter and the person, because in reading and preparing for the show, I noticed that one of the things you wanted to get across to folks who you interacted with through lectures is who he was as a person. I think I read something that said not just the Andrew, but the Andy.
Right. So that's the first thing. So I didn't call him Grandpa. I always just called him Andy. So I'll start off with what he was like as a person. He was incredibly affectionate, loving, and very outgoing and very friendly, which I think you'd look at some of his paintings and think, my God, this guy must be so melancholy or just such an old fart, and it was quite the opposite. He was just full of life. His entire life was devoted to painting. I mean, really, that was it. He'd get up at 5 a.m, very routine oriented, was out the door by, 6:37. He'd have, breakfast with my grandmother, paint all day, go to the studio for lunch, go paint, have models come to the studio, and then always home at 4 o'clock for a nap with my grandmother, and then drinks at 5, NBC Nightly News, in the evening with Tom Brokaw. And I mean, he was just so dedicated. There was just not enough hours in the day for him to paint. And, I think what I didn't appreciate as a young girl, I used to think his work was so boring when I was younger. I'm like, oh my God, where's the color? What's with all these barns? And then I realized he really had this unique way of seeing the world. And as Chad's Ford in Maine became just littered with technology, he just omitted it from his pictures. So to call him a realist isn't really quite accurate, because he's an artist that kind of creates his own reality and omits things and paints people that have been dead for 20 years or a house that's been torn down for 40 years. So
Let me ask you something, if I can understand, and our listeners will understand. When you say he omitted it in connection, in relationship to
technology,
technology. Oh, so he,
telephone poles, wires, TV antennas, I mean, entire, shopping malls, he did cars, highways. He painted Chad's Ford the way he remembered it as a young boy, not the
see.
way it existed in reality.
So if you have, do you have an opinion as to why he was doing that, or what was the explanation?
Because it's an eyesore.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's just awful. I mean, who wants to, Maine, especially stunningly beautiful with the light, and Chad's Ford with just the scenic hills and so forth. And it's just, it looks like crap. You've got all these, developments and stores all over the place, and it just ruins it. And so he wanted kind of pure Chad's Ford. And so that's what he painted.
I see. Okay, well, fair enough. I mean, there are painters who paint urban environments,
Not a big fan of that, unless Edward, I do have to say, I love Edward Hopper, but
okay.
his is more of a voyeuristic urban kind of, I think of like Nighthawks. I don't know if you call that urban, but kind of the diner and the people, but he adds this kind of, as I said, the Hopper adds this kind of voyeuristic gaze and then this great light. I think there's so many painters out there, but there are not a lot of artists, and Andy was an artist.
So how about telling us how you distinguish those two, artist from painter?
Sure. I think a painter, I mean, I live in Philadelphia presently, and I walk outside and I see, all these people outside, just painting or photographing and copying. So I think a painter is someone that doesn't really paint with their heart. They paint with their eyes. Whereas an artist is someone that can look at something and just this very intense emotion is evoked by what he sees. And he has the ability to capture that and to show people what he's feeling. And that's communicated through incredible technical ability, in unusual perspective, and just very strong diagonals,
Okay.
I mean, it's just, I mean, it when you see it, when it's like the Supreme Court says, right? Porn, it when you see it, right? Shitty art when you see it. It just looks terrible. You see these artists and they can't paint hands, for example. They look like claws. Well, they shouldn't be painting hands. They should just stop painting hands and just hide them. And it just looks awful.
Well,
I went on a date once and this guy's like, please don't go in the gallery and say that you don't like what you see. And I'm thinking to myself, but don't take me in the gallery,
Right. Okay. All right. So hands, I was thinking of an image. I remember in grammar school, I guess is what you call it, we would use our hands to paint turkeys. So we would do that, but any of that, I'm sure that's not what you're making reference to.
No, but I mean, I had actually never seen that until I'm good friends with my ex-husband. I remember when I went to his mom's house, I saw that little hand with the turkey. I'm like, what's that? He's like, didn't you have a childhood? I'm like, apparently not.
Right. Okay. So back on track, you have lectured, given talks all over the world. You did a TED Talk. You've been before audiences, primarily talking about Andrew Wyeth, but also others in your family. You have a famous
My
name.
uncle Jamie. Yep.
So in those discussions, you've had to either address, or people have asked questions about, how would you describe, and you've started already, how would you describe what, let's just take Andrew for the moment, what Andrew was trying to do besides painting? Would you call most of what Andrew Wyeth has done landscapes, or is that
No,
too
absolutely. No, you've got
simplistic?
portraits, still lifes, landscapes, but then you have to say, well, what's a portrait? I mean, like my uncle, for example, will do portraits of chickens or pigs, or he'll do a bale of hay and he'll call that a portrait. So each artist has their own definition, right? So like for my grandfather, a portrait is defined by someone looking at you. So he does not consider Christina's world a portrait because she's not looking at you. So I think we got to be careful when we, and just be like I always say when I give my presentations, you can't take what I'm telling you and apply it to other artists. You just can't. It's very specific to Andy or to Jamie.
So again, in my travels to various art museums, I too was a resident of the Philadelphia area for a number of years, went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But any place I've gone and there's a docent or a curator or whatever, or somebody leading folks on tour, it seems invariably that a question is asked, something like, well, what did the artist mean by this? Or what was in the artist's head? Or why did the artist paint it this color or that color? What was the artist trying?
So, I don't know which is worse, the question or the fact that the docent has the audacity to answer.
Okay. So when you are standing in front of or delivering a lecture or a PowerPoint or combination or whatever, and you're talking about the art, other than what do you say? What's
he told me to say?
Which is that's what I'm asking you for.
Yeah. So I only go with what he has said, period. I have a book in front of me. It's called my Andy Journal. And it's basically, I just started taking notes when I was 15 on everything he said. So, I mean, I can like open it and read you something just to kind of give you an example if you'd like. But
sure.
Here, let me get it. Give me 1 second.
Of course. For all those tuning in, we are talking to Victoria Browning Wyeth, the only grandchild of the artist Andrew Wyeth. Her discussion today is going to be primarily about Andrew Wyeth, but we're also going to talk about the contemporary realist Jamie Wyeth. But right now we're focusing on Andrew or Andy.
Yeah, Andy. Okay, so your question, right? How do I figure out what to say? So he would tell me what to say about specific pictures, but then I would ask more general questions. So this is from an interview that I did with him on September 27th, 2004. And I said, how do your models differ and what they talk about while they're posing? Were any of them particularly chatty or quiet? If so, how did this affect the picture? He said, it's sort of a natural thing. Sometimes it gets personal. A person posing takes on their whole life. I don't think they even realize it. They tell you very personal things. Most of it goes in one ear and out the other. I'm so lost in what I'm trying to depict. Some of it's moving, and some of it makes me feel stronger about the painting. I like to get to know the models in a very natural way. I don't go around hunting for people to paint. I usually meet them by chance, and I like to get to know them. For example, Nagishik, which is actually in the show that this
at the Asheville Museum of Art, yes.
Yep, at the Asheville. He said, Nagishik, when I was painting him in front of the fire, his mouth was partly open. He'd make these Native American chants, and I got to know the whole background of his life. So there's a great example of he's telling me about a specific picture, but then he's saying, here's how I meet my models. So I might be doing a PowerPoint presentation looking at a portrait of Helga, or looking at a portrait of, I don't know, there's another woman in the Asheville show named Ann Call. It's a painting called On the Edge. And I could talk about how he says it's kind of a natural thing, how I meet the models. So for example, with Ann Call, the woman in the Asheville show from On the Edge, she applied for a job and she was sitting there and she said, look, I like walking through cemeteries at night and picking flowers. And I think most people would think, what the hell is wrong with this person? And my grandfather said, like, oh, that's amazing. What kind of person walks through a cemetery at night and B, takes flowers from the dead, And so there's where I would take something he said, and then I could apply it to 1,000 pictures. So, and, this is just a small sample, but like what I would do is, I would, if you can see here, so like I would bring a notepad with me, and I would just write out everything he said, and then I'd run home and type it up. So I have a 700-page journal going back to when I was 15 with just all of these random notes on it. And sometimes, look, we all lose inspiration in life. And sometimes I do. I get frustrated with my job. Someone pisses me off, something. And so what I do is I have a duffel bag of notes that I have not yet typed up, that are all from interviews with him. And I just grab something in the duffel bag and I read it, and it kind of recharges my batteries and lets me know I'm on the right path.
So let me ask you what sort of a small question, but it seems related. Did your grandfather, Andrew Wyeth, I can't resist calling him by his formal name, did he name his pictures? Did he? And if he
Yes.
did he name them, more straightforwardly, if it was, Helga or whatever that was the name?
So that's a very interesting question. So what he has told people is my grandmother names them. Now that's not totally true, because in his studio, for example, the studio in Maine that my dad and I own on the property, he'd sit there writing the titles on the wall, or in his sketch pads, he'd write the title. And so here's an example. So he's at home with my grandmother in 1947. He's just finished this composition, a tempera called Wind from the Sea. It's owned by the National Gallery. It's these curtains blowing. And my grandmother said, well, what's going on? And, he said, well, there was this wonderful breeze from the sea. This wind came in. She said, that's it, wind from the sea. So I think sometimes it was collaborative. Sometimes she would just come up with the title. Sometimes he would come up with the title. But I think quite often he would just give her credit, which is interesting, and that's a whole nother kind of area to go into. My grandmother was painfully shy. And I think it was very hard for her. I mean, she never finished college and so forth. I mean, she was very smart, but not formally educated. And I think it was hard for her that she was, a housewife. And so he gave her a lot of control very early on in their marriage, titling, framing, curating, which was rather unheard of, and this one day, this man said, oh, I think it's so great your grandmother made your grandfather. And I was furious. I said, what are you talking about? And when I went home, he said, what are you talking about? And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, she made me who I am. I said, that is not true. And here I am sitting here telling him, no, you're wrong, but he felt that to really succeed as an artist, he needed her behind him. But I think that she helped him in ways that were good and helped him in some ways that weren't so great. I think she was very critical, of his artwork. I was having dinner with my boyfriend the other night, and he said, well, what did she say? Like, what was she like? Because she was a very critical person. And she'd say, take that out of the picture. And I'd sit there at dinner thinking to myself, are you serious? How can you say that to him? Sometimes she was right, sometimes she was wrong, but I would never say that to an artist. So, I mean, can you imagine being Shakespeare's wife and telling him, take that sonnet out,
We're talking to Victoria Wyeth, the granddaughter of Andrew Wyeth, and we're talking today about her perspective on her grandfather and his art and the many experiences that she had in talking with him, talking about art, talking about the meaning of certain paintings and so on and so forth, and his inspirations, I guess. And we drifted a bit to talk about, did he name the art? And you've given us your answer to that. I mean, the reason I asked the question in part was, it strikes me that the authors of poetry or novels spend a lot of time thinking about what is the right title to ascribe to this work. What do I want to say? I'm sure the marketing folks assist in that process because they would like to make sure that somebody sees the title or looks at the title and then goes forward and actually thumbs through the book and then ultimately buys it. But I'm guessing that probably was not in any way, shape, or form what Andrew Wyeth did, or the motivation for him
I
coming
think
up with it.
if he had his druthers, he would take the picture and just tape it to the wall. I
Right.
think part of him did not like framing, titling, signing. You know, he was just this very chill guy that just wanted to paint. That's it. You know, he just didn't care about wealth or fame or titles. You know, it's part of the game, right? You have to title and frame. But honestly, if all people are looking at is the title, then they've missed the whole point of the painting. You know, and
So,
people stand either too damn close or too far away. And you need to get in close and then back up and go back and forth. I don't know if you know the Gardner Museum, the Isabella Gardner Museum in Boston. So my father took me there last year for my birthday. And I was looking at a Rembrandt self-portrait. And Daddy looked at me and said, stand back. And I stood back and I just about fell over. You have to look at pictures properly, you know, and don't just look at the title, look at the whole thing and then look at the title.
so during the time, and you know, as you indicated, the you had frequent talks. You talked about art. Did you get to a point where you actually revered Andrew Wyeth, that you were basically awed by his miraculous talent, or was it was like talking to Andy, talking to
It was my
a friend?
grandfather. He was a pain in the ass, just as I'm a pain in the ass. And he pissed me off, and I pissed him off. You know, I'd ask too many questions, or he'd give me these ridiculous answers. You know, I said, "What's your favorite painting?" "Oh, the one I'm working on." I'm like, "What kind of answer is that? That's not an answer." You know, or he would just, or he'd roll his eyes, or he'd pretend he didn't hear something. You know, I mean, he was my grandfather. I didn't revere him. I know. I mean, he was just a normal. Do you ever read that book, Everybody Poops? You know, right? Like, he's just a normal dude.
If I did,
right?
I wouldn't. If I did, I wouldn't admit it. But go
Okay,
ahead.
fine.
I
But
get
it's
the
like
point.
he's a normal guy that goes to the bathroom, puts his pants on just like everyone else. Yes, there were moments when it was weird. Like he had a show in 2004 at the Philadelphia Museum. And, you know, it's funny because I'm getting ready to move to Maine, and I'm sitting here reflecting and packing up my apartment, thinking about all my memories of Philly. And I'm driving down the highway and there's a bus with his painting on it, zooming by me. And I remember I called him, like, "You better not die," you know, and he's like, "I'm not planning on it." But, you know, I would say it was really after he died that I kind of took a step back and was like, holy cow, you know, and sometimes I do catch myself staring at his work, not in awe of who he was, just he's so prolific and he's so damn good. He was so good. It's just, yeah.
So more in retrospect, I mean, because let's face it, how many people had the opportunity that you had to have a close, I'll use the word intimate for want of a better word, but a close, easy to talk with relationship with a man who is revered by many in the art world. And you say he was prolific, and I want to talk about what that means here. So you were in a unique position, and maybe while it was happening, again, he's primarily your granddad, who happens to have this particular vocation, talent, whatever, but that didn't stop you from thinking of him in familial terms. But afterwards, you had to say, at least from time to time, as you said, wow, that was something else. The experiences that I had with him, and the experience I have when I look at his art today in 2022.
I now, you have to remember, I was also 25, you know, when I moved to Chad's Ford. I was 29 when he died. I was just, you know, I was 29. I was just not thinking clearly. And I just didn't, you know, my greatest regret is I never really said thank you for everything he did for me. Not my career, but just letting me in his heart and in his mind. And I had no confidence in myself as a speaker, and he gave me confidence and said, "You're the best, you know, you're the best at speaking of my work." And I'm like, "No, I'm not." I'm really not that good. Nope, you are. And, and he believed in me in a time when I just didn't believe in myself. And I'm constantly surrounded by people that are doubting me and criticizing me. And I just remember that he believed in me, and all these haters, they have no idea what the hell they're talking about.
Well, let me ask you a couple questions regarding that. I have some follow-up questions to what you just spoke about. Did you ever get the sense in these discussions that you had with Andrew Wyeth that
You got to
he,
stop calling him that. It's just so
Andy,
weird. Okay.
Mr. Wyeth, that guy,
Okay.
that he wanted you to be a spokesperson at the time, but after his death, to carry out and spread the word about who he was as an artist and so on and so forth? Did you feel that you were under that obligation, or is it just something?
So it was never an obligation. First of all, I would not use the term spokesperson. I think he knew, he saw something in me, my interest in his work and my ability to speak publicly about it. And those two things, I think, gave him the confidence to say, okay, here's, my mini version of me that's going to keep my memory alive. I don't think he had any idea that the lectures would explode the way they have. I don't think he had any idea that I'd be hauling his paintings into prisons and doing, pop-up galleries for prisoners. I think he'd be so excited, but I think he had no idea. Like the TEDx talk that I did, I don't think he ever thought that I'd be sitting there in front of, 3,500 kids speaking on him and my uncle. And I certainly never thought Zoom would be possible, this is the silver lining of the pandemic. I do pro bono lectures for kids all over the United States. I did a lecture in Israel, on Zoom. I don't think he ever thought that, nor did I, that this would happen. But I have no doubt in my mind that this is what he wanted.
So give us some idea of, you use the term prolific. We all know what that means, but give us some idea of how many individual works.
Thousands and thousands. You look at some of his temperas and there are 70 preliminary studies for one painting. It's the Wyeth office gets pissed off when I say, how many he's done, which I don't even understand why it's so secretive. But so to respect them, I'm not going to sit here and give numbers, but it is mind blowing. And it's really hard to impress me. And I look at his work and I just think, Jesus, how did he do this? It was just wild.
Well, let me ask you a question, which I hope you don't think is naive, but besides the fact that his paintings hang in a number of galleries, I'm sure that many of his paintings have also been sold to individuals or private companies. Not that this is the measure of the man, but what's the most expensive price that you, if you know it, or the
Sure,
range
there
of
was a
prices?
painting that's sold, I think it was either Sotheby's or Christie's before he died. So this was in like 2006, 2007. It was called Erickson's. It's a tempera that with the buyer's premium, I think it was 10.466 million.
I see.
That broke the auction records.
Okay.
And it was actually just donated to, I think it was the Virginia Museum, which is incredible. Paintings like that belong in a museum. It's wonderful that collectors have them, but at the end of the day, it should, I own this painting called Master Bedroom of a dog sleeping on the bed. And I have loaned it since I inherited it, since I was in college. And for the first time, I just hung it, at a house. And it belongs in a museum, but I wanted to enjoy it.
We're talking to Victoria Browning Wyeth. I keep saying this, but for those just tuning in, the only grandchild of Andrew/Andy Wyeth. And you are also related to an illustrator named N.C. Wyeth, and you are the niece of a contemporary realist, Jamie Wyeth. Fair question to ask you if N.C. Wyeth and Jamie Wyeth are still with us.
So NC was killed on October 19th, 1945 in a car accident. My
Hmm.
uncle is doing great. I spoke to him a couple days ago, and he's painting. He is also massively prolific, like my grandfather.
Would you, again, presumably overly simplistic question, do you see any similarities in terms of the art of Jamie versus Andy? But maybe first you might want to describe, I've seen Jamie described as a contemporary realist. Is there
Yeah,
any
so I mean,
similarities?
yeah, I mean, I think all those labels are, BS. I think the first similarity is their work ethic. You have to take a step back and say, I mean, these guys aren't going into an office, 9 to 5 with a boss, but yet my uncle's up at 6 in the morning painting, right? And the difference between Jamie and Andy too, Jamie paints at night, very late, which is fascinating, right? That's number one. So I'd say the work ethic. Number two, this sheer love of capturing the world around them. The difference, though, Jamie, the whole family, we're all these crazy dreamers. Jamie paints his dreams, and they're really cool. So I think that's what, and also, and I mean this with the great amount of love and respect. I mean, we are weird. This is a weird family, weird in a, just kind of like macabre and so. Jamie just incorporates this kind of funky personality into his work in a way that my grandfather doesn't. You look at Andy's work and you'd say, my God, this guy's such a bump on the log. You look at Jamie's work and say to yourself, I'd like to hang out with this dude on an island, stranded for a month, and my head would probably explode. And so I think Jamie takes our family's imagination the way that NC Wyeth did and incorporates it into the work, but his work is grounded in reality, whereas NC's work was based on, books and illustration.
So when you say that Jamie Wyeth, you look at his picture and then you think, I could identify with that person well enough to have a drink, go to a bar, have a hot dog, whatever. What can you give us some color into that? What does that, how do you get to that, other than people say, yeah, I'd like to hang out with that dude? What is it about Jamie's work that you think creates that kind of bond?
I think you look at his work and sometimes it just makes you laugh. Like you look at the way he depicts animals and he kind of anthropomorphizes them. The animals are almost smiling at you. And then there's other work that's just so kind of dark and you just think to yourself, wow, I'd like to be in this dude's head. So I think Jamie's personality really comes through in his work in a way that my grandfather's unfortunately doesn't. And what I give my uncle a lot of credit for, I mean, this is a tough family to come from. I'm very lucky I don't paint, right? So Jamie is Andy's son, but he just totally carved his own way of his own style, his own medium. And I just give him so much credit. It's a tough group to come from. My grandmother she was really tough. And, Jamie emerged victorious and did his own thing. And I just think that's awesome. And he's a good guy. He's a good, loving person. I think you've got a lot of people that are famous and it gets to their head. And Jamie and my aunt Phyllis, who has passed away, do so many good things, for philanthropic with children, with abandoned, retired race horses. He's not jet setting. I mean, he helps people, which is so important. To be famous is great, but you have to use that fame for something awesome and kind of harness that power and do something with it. Otherwise, you're just as terrible as everyone else.
It doesn't require you to go up for 30 seconds in somebody's rocket ship to prove that you can do it.
I mean, I'm sure it would be fun. I mean, I'm terrified of heights, so I would never do that. But, like they started this, I mean, it's great. It's called the Herring Gut Learning Center in Maine. And they take kids that have had trouble in school and they educate them and they teach them, I mean, all these hands-on activities. And it's just awesome. He's a good person. He's a loving person. And he's so good with animals. Yeah, I'm not an animal person, so I just don't understand. And he's got a great heart. He really does.
So to spend a little bit more time on Jamie, uh, did Jamie get active or direct encouragement from Andy, aka Andrew Wyeth, to pursue art, or did Jamie just decide that's what he wanted to do and he had other mentors or inspirations for
I
that?
think that Jamie could have said he wanted to be, a rocket launcher, and my grandfather would have supported him. So because Andy was his dad, he loved him and supported him, whatever he did. I'm sure the fact that Jamie was an artist, my grandfather loved. But, I asked my uncle, I said, well, when you were training with your Aunt Carolyn, Andy's sister, did Andy come and see the work or ask what you were painting? He said, no, it was just perfectly natural. I just come home and we'd have a normal dinner. And so my grandparents encouraged my uncle because he was their son and they loved him. But it wasn't like, well, let me see your work and put it next to mine,
Okay, so now I want to ask you another question. And again, those just tuning in, or those who hopefully have stayed with us, I am talking with Victoria Browning Wyeth, grandchild of Andy. You're forcing me to say Andy Wyeth, otherwise known as Andrew, to persons who are not family members. And we're talking about both Andy Wyeth's work, and we've been talking for the last several minutes about Jamie Wyeth. I want to ask you this. Did you have the opportunity, besides having extensive conversations with your grandfather, to observe him while he was, quote, in the act of painting and to peer over his shoulder, or not?
No. So he did not like people watching him paint. He said, do you let people watch you have sex? I said, no, I don't. I try not to, unless the person I'm having sex with or having sex with me. He said, right. So I don't want someone watching me paint because I feel like that's like having someone watch me have sex. So the only time that I saw him paint was when I came home and he was painting, which wasn't very often, or if I'd wake up and he was outside the window painting, or if I was posing for him.
Okay, so you mentioned earlier in this discussion that your grandfather was, very rigorous about a schedule. He'd get up early, and he'd have breakfast, he'd go out, and then he'd come back to his studio. So in the going out, was he going to a place where he wanted to paint what was happening in that place?
I think it depends. I think sometimes he'd go out for a burger for lunch. Sometimes he would go to a model's house and paint them there. Sometimes he'd just screw around in the car and see what, it's not so rule oriented,
Right.
It's like you go for a walk, right? Well, you don't know where you're going to, maybe you have a rough idea of where you're going to walk, but you might go here, you might go there, and he might see something, pull over and do a drawing, just happens.
But the way in which the production of the art piece was carried out was in a studio. I mean, he might.
No, the watercolors are done, it's called en plein air. They're done outside.
I see.
The temperas are done in the studio. The preliminary studies for the temperas or the watercolors are done outside, and then he brings them to the studio, scatters them about on the floor, and does the picture.
Okay. For those who are not familiar with that term tempera, can you briefly describe what that is?
I've had many a boyfriend that have called it tempura. So tempura is battered and fried, food. Egg tempera is one of the oldest mediums in existence besides encaustic, which is encaustic is kind of wax with powdered pigment. Egg tempera is the yolk of a white egg. The brown eggs have too much oil, so you pierce the yolk, you get the contents. You mix that with distilled water, purified water, and ground color pigment. Lasts for 3 days, and you have a palette with deep wells, and each well is a different color, a different mixture. If you actually look at his very early temperas, on the back of them, they have the recipe, if you will, for how much of this and how much of that, until he finally memorized it.
So let me understand though, is tempera something like a sketch pad of something that will later be transformed into a, quote, regular painting?
Tempera is a medium.
Tempera is the medium itself.
Is the medium with which he uses to create a painting. So he worked in pencil, watercolor, and egg tempera.
I see.
He used to work in oil and pen and ink, pastel was a long time ago though.
So what drew him to use, and I've not heard of that medium, but I'm
Okay.
not a student of the arts, is what drew Andy to that medium? And
Detail. It
okay,
allows for excruciating detail. If you think of a spectrum, watercolors on one end and temperas on the other. So watercolor is really wild and it kind of controls you and it's washy and quick. Tempera is just every single hair on someone's head is done in painstaking detail. So if you got a crappy artist, they're not going to work in tempera because they can't control the brush like that. You have to be a good artist.
how often or how much of, let's just say, art that's produced or created today uses that medium?
Not a lot.
Okay.
I mean, it's hard, it's very hard. It's like going and it's so much easier I love photography. So it's so easy to take a digital photo, but it's only a few people, right, that can go in the lab and actually print it. So,
Okay.
I mean, it just requires more skill.
Okay.
And it's not fast. People want quick. They want, and quick isn't always good.
Okay. So I know that we had discussed not having this interview focused too much on you personally, which I have understood and agreed to honor that. But you are not a painter. You said that was not something that was.
I just can't. I'd love to. I would love to work in egg tempera more than anything.
So did you try? So evidently you tried at some point. You did attempt to create paintings of some sort, and then just decided that wasn't yours. Oh, yeah,
yeah. So I had to take art my freshman year in college, and it was just awful. I just did a terrible, terrible job, and my uncle had to do my final project for me, and it was just, I'm just not good. I don't have the technical ability.
Okay. But interestingly enough, to me, and hopefully the audience, is you're a photographer, which I take it means not only that you take photographs, but you take photographs, work with photographs to create a quality image, and maybe you sell them, and maybe
I don't sell.
So they're just for you.
For me. Yeah. I only photograph things that I really care about and that I like. So, I go skiing with my boyfriend and I'll photograph his sons, and they'll say, well, why do you take so many pictures? And how do you explain that I enjoy capturing the moment? I had a boyfriend once, he said, don't you feel that you're missing something by taking pictures all the time? And I thought to myself, that's a really stupid comment, because it's quite the opposite. I feel that I'm capturing a moment by taking a picture.
So again, as I spoke about with you earlier in the show, you have lectured, literally, to use that word, which I don't use very often, all over the world, talking about the paintings of Andrew, talking about the art of Jamie as well. And I guess I want to ask you, and you've gotten a large following of folks that love that and are interested in it, from small towns to cities across the world that are known for their appreciation of art. Tokyo to Paris, I think, is what I read. What is it? Have you thought about, or you've figured out from your interactions, why is the art still so appreciated in these days? It's obviously there must be something that has resonated, that continues to resonate, because we see art of a million different kinds. I'm sure that when Andy started painting, there were wide variations, but nothing like what we're seeing today. And then of course we have the whole social media where people don't
Yeah.
even need to walk into a
Yeah,
museum?
I mean,
What is it
I
about
yeah,
his art in particular, and Jamie's, if you wish to speak about it, that continues to resonate?
they're so damn good. They're so good. You stand in front of their pictures and you just freeze. And I think they transport you to memories that are olfactory, that are visual, that are tactile. I mean, I know with me, when I look at his work, sometimes I kind of lose my breath, and it just, my, it's tricky because for me, I mean, they're painting my life too, like my uncle and my grandfather, right? So it's like my photo album. But I think people, it just makes them pause and kind of smell the roses.
So we have a little bit of time left in the interview. I want to talk a little bit specifically about the lecture that you're going to be doing this Saturday at the Asheville Art Museum. Is this your first time doing this sort of thing in Asheville, or?
Yes, I don't believe I've ever been to Asheville before.
And what was the attraction to come here?
So Bank of America has a fantastic collection of my family's work, and they loan it to museums all over the world. So it was just in Albany, New York. Now it's at Asheville. And so Asheville asked if I would come and do a gallery talk in the morning and then a PowerPoint at night.
Okay. Do you have now, Asheville self-describes itself, or its boosters to describe itself, as a eclectic town, an artsy town, a theater town, a music town, in addition to beer town and whatever. Do you have a sense of what kind of reception you might get, and whether the people in Asheville are going to be as interested as the people in other locales?
I have no idea. I mean, I certainly hope so. But I mean, I was giving a lecture at a museum once, and I looked at this woman and I did not identify myself. I said, "Do you like Andrew Wyeth?" "No, I can't stand him." I said, "Well, why are you here?" "Well, I just want to hear what she has to say." And I thought, oh. And so I got up and I said, "Well, there are a lot of people here that don't like Andy." Then I just focused on her the whole lecture and just kind of smiled and winked at her. So I'm sure there'll be people that hate the show. I'm sure there'll be people that love the show. But I if they don't know Andy and Jamie and my great grandpa, I hope they do after the show. Give them a chance.
So now that you've opened that issue a bit, when you give your lecture, I'm sure that you are open to questions and entertain
Of
questions.
course.
Do things ever get controversial, heated?
I mean, I'm better when I was younger, I'd get more pissy. But I think my boyfriend always tells me I need to develop a thicker skin, which I'm working on. I mean, I'll go home and call him mad or crying, but I won't show it in public. But yeah, I mean, it's my family. If someone asks a really personal question or starts insulting them, of course I get pissed, but I'm not getting paid to get angry, right? So I have to represent the museum and represent my family. But yeah, I mean, I'm human. So
right. But the reason I asked the question is we're looking at art. We're talking about art. We're talking about artists. We're talking
about my family, though.
And your family. Right.
Yeah.
But me, if I'm an observer and I decide to see an exhibition, I want to be there. I may have certain positive or potentially negative reactions to some art, but if I'm signing up, so to speak, as people are when they come to the lectures, or making a deliberate effort to see a particular artist, I presumably have read up on the artist. I know something about the artist. I get there.
Not necessarily.
Well, could be. And then I learn a lot. I can't imagine having it in any way, shape, or form move into a realm where there's controversy. But you've been in various
no one's thrown paint on the paintings yet, or
or tempera.
Yeah,
eggs would be a problem.
Yeah, eggs, or no one's asked for their money back, but I'm sure there's a first time for everything, right? It'll keep me grounded and humble, won't it?
Okay. Well, as you survey what you've been doing for how many years have
So
you
I
been
just turned
out there?
43 and I started when I was about 15. So 20, 25, 28 years. Jeez. Holy cow. Oh my God.
That sounds like a long time, but you still have the passion, it would appear, and you still feel motivated to,
Because I love them. They're my family.
right.
They've made me who I am, you know,
So
and for that, I'm very grateful.
now you've done other things in your life, which we may not necessarily want to get into, but you've done things that are very different than having anything to do with art and having anything to do with,
Yeah, my mom's family is very academic. So I went to graduate school for psychology. I studied the history of 19th century psychiatry. And then I got a job for 10 years as a therapist. I specialized in sex crimes in men, in paraphilias. And I had a good friend in college who was sexually assaulted as a child. And I wanted to make sure that I did something to kind of help people that had gone through things like that. And so I found it easier to deal with the perpetrators than the victims. So that's what I did. And then I stopped. I unfortunately developed breast cancer when I was about 35. And so I stopped seeing patients. And then I went and worked for a gentleman named Dr. Aaron Beck, who discovered something called cognitive behavioral therapy. And I worked for him for about 3 years, and he just passed away at 100 in November. And so now I'm moving to Maine to hang out with my boyfriend and give lectures and just focusing on a lot of pro bono stuff for schools.
so can you see the way forward for you in the next several years? What do you think might be other avenues, perhaps related to what you've been doing since you started the lectures series for the Wyeths, for your family, as you say? What new things or new avenues would you feel like you'd want to explore and which are available to you?
I think utilizing Zoom to do more pro bono lectures for students. I love focusing on fourth grade through college. And this platform allows me to reach people that I never would have been able to. So I think just doing more philanthropic things.
Do you see a way in which, besides the use of the technical aspects of Zoom and virtual settings, anything that's could be described as really avant-garde? So I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. And this is not that avant-garde, but recently we went to an exhibition for Van Gogh, which has been
The immersive thing, right?
The immersive around the country.
I don't think that's going to happen with my family's work.
And that's not something that
Copyrighted. No, that's not going to happen.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we've sort of covered the ground here, but I want to give you, we have a few minutes remaining. Is there anything that we haven't covered?
I think if there are any teachers that are listening, please reach out to me I have a website. You can just Google my name, and I would love to do some fabulous pro bono lectures on Zoom for your students. Okay, well, that's a good invitation. And again, did you give them the coordinates to get to it? It's victoriawyeth.com. If you just Google my name, my website will pop up. I'm pretty easy to find. There's not a lot of Victoria Wyeths out there. And what do you think is the right age for people to access the sort of lectures that you give? Like the kids ones, I'd say fourth grade and older. I think it's tricky below fourth grade. I mean, they can appreciate it, but it's technical and it's just tough, so I'd say fourth grade and older is pretty good. Okay. Well, I want to thank my guest, Victoria Browning Wyeth, today for spending the time with us to educate us about her wonderful and extraordinary family and bring us a little closer to knowing a little bit more about them. But of course, not to be too trite here, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I think I want to encourage people to see the exhibit in Asheville and to see and those who are beyond Asheville, as this podcast is
available nationwide should be looking to find out more about Andrew Wyeth, NC Wyeth, Jamie Wyeth, the Wyeths in general, and explore their art and give themselves the opportunity to witness the greatness and wonderfulness that you've been able to share with us today on this interview.
Well, thanks for having me, Mark.
Well, it's been a real pleasure and a real honor. Thank you so much.